All right. So the third question I wanted to tackle today, and this will be a little faster because I've gone over the ground a couple times already, is what happens to our humanity when we do inhumane things, right? That when the zombie apocalypse happens, the idea is that the zombies will drive the humans to do things that they normally wouldn't do. You see this in every movie. The zombies, like any other kind of natural disaster, drive the humans to fight for resources amongst themselves and end up looking terrible as people, right? Not because the zombies did anything necessarily. It could be a swarm of bees, but because the people are fighting amongst themselves, right? So there are some films that complicate this question by blending the line in which people start to act more and more like zombies, right? In 28 Days Later, the zombies are not undead, but rather virus-infected people who are as angry as people can ever be. So what happens when one of the characters becomes angry without becoming infected? So angry that he starts to act like a zombie. The film sees a clear line there because the character who's angry can stop being angry. The ones who are infected cannot. But it's a much easier, or it's a much harder line to draw definitively than the one that says you have to die first and then rise up to be across it. Right? Another text that does this really well is the comic book The Walking Dead. Now the TV show, I'm not as confident about how I can argue that yet, but the comic book quite explicitly wrestles with this text. And very early on, say volume 4 of the 17 that they've done now, the main character explains quite clearly that the Walking Dead are not the zombies, right? That the Walking Dead are the people who are left in this hellish world surviving by any means necessary. And quite regularly, the characters are forced to do things that are awful in order to survive, right? They have to turn on other people or be so suspicious of other people that they can't make connections. There's all sorts of things that happen, in part because this is a very long-form narrative. You don't get this in films because the films are only 2 hours. Actually, the premise, Robert Kirkman, when he was writing this, says the premise of this comic is what happens after the movie's over. Right? If you have a band of survivors who are still alive after the movie's over, then what? Right? So this is the comic that keeps going and keeps going and keeps going and getting more and more grim, really. Finally, you get something like Land of the Dead, which is not a very good movie, but has a lot of interesting ideas in it. Right? Because in this one, the zombies get fed up with being treated like trash and actually like stage a revolution, which really doesn't make a lot of sense because Romero does not imbue them with much more initiative than the original zombies had, but enough to gather up as a group and cross the river, really. But it is an interesting idea, this idea that the humans would treat even zombies so badly that the zombies come back to get them again. So I think that I've covered all of these things, right? That it challenges us to ponder our mortality. You know, I think that the argument about how quickly we would descend into vicious fighting with one another comes up most strongly in zombie movies because unlike movies where some other natural disaster happens, there's no downtime. There's no time between when the crisis starts and when things are awful. So people descend very quickly into madness. Right? And again, it challenges how we understand others in that we have to think about that line between us and them. Right? There's a great sequence in the Walking Dead comic where one of the characters chases down in a truck another character whom he believes is betraying his group, runs him over with the truck, then gets out and throttles him. And as he's throttling him, he says something to the effect of, "You people are savages. You people would do anything to us if you had the chance." And he murders him, right? I mean, it's quite distinct as a, well, you know, pot calling the kettle black issue, right? This is a man who's driven to the edge in order to protect his people. And he accepts that. Layered on top of that is, of course, the fact that he's a police officer and still thinks of himself with that identity. So to wrap up, this presentation, like I said, it's set up in the sort of pedagogical mode. Part of the idea is to have us think about the relationship between big ideas in our work here at Columbia. So I thought that I would end with a little bit of a discussion about places that these kinds of ideas come up in the LAS core. So I made a list going through the catalog, and I tried to do some searching for whether these are being offered in the spring, and that was a difficult search, enough that I didn't have time to both make the sheet and make sure they're all there. So some of them are offered this spring, others are still in the catalog and so will be available. But there are a number of different ways that you could explore these ideas more fully in your work throughout the LAS core, not just in my zombies class, which is of course being offered every January. I gotta plug it, Sarah. She's laughing at me. But the idea is that these kinds of ideas move back and forth between lots of work we do, right? Whether you're doing the science of how the mind works, what it is that makes us who we are, evolution of the mind, to the history of the Caribbean, right? A lot of what we talk about in this class is the way that racism played into the notion of the voodoo zombie and the fear that came out of the post-colonial European perspective, especially of Haiti, where the revolution took, where they murdered the Europeans and didn't let them come back, right? The idea of the uprising African slave sort of stayed in the white person's mentality in Haiti and the Caribbean because of Haiti. And the zombie slave, especially turning on the master, becomes a sort of interesting replay of that question. And then, I also put the science fiction things in there because a lot of what's going on in science fiction is going on in the way that I engage with zombie films and writing in my class. This question of tackling ideas, thinking about how texts lead us into thought experiments about what could be, or what might be, or what is right now, seen through a lens. So with that, I will wrap up and say that we need to study zombies. We need to study popular culture because our culture is the way that we have a conversation with one another, right? That way more people watched Honey Boo Boo, Here Comes Honey Boo Boo Child than the news the last time it was on, right? It's a frightening, I don't know that that's true, but definitely watch Breaking Bad, right? I mean, the conversation about, I would say the national conversation about drug abuse in this country is happening as much on Breaking Bad as it is in the news, right? So how are we to understand our relationship to one another if we don't study the means by which we have these conversations? All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, this wasn't intended to be a conversation, so please, if you have questions for Brendan, shoot.
Yep.
Hi. All right, I'm not gonna lie, man. You just brought up a lot of ethical issues I never thought about because I am an active zombie killer.
Okay.
According to the CDC, you're not supposed to kill zombies because it's unethical. Would you say that you would agree to that if you seen like me running towards you, arms outstretched, trying to bite your neck off?
Well, there's a difference between self-defense and hunting down zombies, right? Self-defense, I think I believe very strongly in the right to self-defense. So if you're running toward me with your arms stretched out trying to bite me, infected or not, I have the right to fend you off. I would say though that most zombie films suggest that it's okay to just kill zombies just 'cause, right? And I think that there's a case to be made, especially if the zombies show any kind of memory, that we should think very hard before we take up wholesale slaughter.
And I can respect that because I love zombies, G. That's why I'm here. Like, you understand, I'm sick as a dog, still sitting here to listen to this lecture.
All right.
Man, like, tough. But anyway, I've never watched a movie that had zombies be emotional and interact with people and wave back, because that was gonna be my task. Hey, if you can't wave back, if you can't whistle, you getting shot.
Well, I understand that.
Was key.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
in the case of a large epidemic, do you think you would make it? Because I would come and try to
oh,
find you.
no, I have little children. I would not make it. I would die trying to protect them. That's my, I mean, I probably should be like stockpiling things. See, one of the things about, there's a whole thread of people who are interested in zombies who really take the survival aspect seriously. And what's interesting is there's a lot of value to that, because to be prepared for a zombie apocalypse, as the CDC says, is to be prepared for any major disaster.
Yes.
If you're ready for the zombies, you have all the supplies you need, right? Because the main problem in surviving the zombie apocalypse is enough survival supplies, right? The zombies themselves aren't probably the issue. I mean, they will be, living in Chicago is a bad choice.
Isn't being a zombie part of a spiritual world the Caribbean, and aren't zombies on the edge of the, you know, kind of like the guard or the boundary around what can hold the best? And if you're not holding the best, that's the boundary around which the zombies live, because they haven't been properly interred.
Well, you know, I'm going to say that I know some about voodoo. We do talk about it in the class. There's a great film, if anybody wants, and book, if you want to go learn more about this, called Divine Horseman. The book is about the film, but then you actually can get the film at the Columbia Library. And it's Maya Deren is an anthropologist. She went to Haiti in the mid-40s, I want to say, and filmed a bunch of voodoo rituals and talked about the nature of voodoo as a religious practice, right? So voodoo is a possession-based religion. The idea is that when you do a voodoo ritual, you actually become possessed by the Loa, or one of the gods. And they use the phrase riding, being ridden by the god, in the same way that a cowboy rides a horse. The god rides the person they're possessing. And so possession and control of the soul is certainly a part of the voodoo mythos. Now, there's an argument to be made about the zombie in particular, because when you go and try to read about zombies in Haiti, it seems like they really exist or existed in ways that you can't argue the Hollywood zombie. Like, there's nobody out there, you know, pointing to historical documents and saying, look at this. Whereas there's a lot of writing about Haiti that talks about zombies in terms of first-person accounts, like, I encountered this zombie. And it's not from hundreds of years ago. It's from the last 100, times when things were much more verifiable. And so there have been a number of theories, none of which I think has been widely accepted, but all of which are sort of in play, about what this could mean. The most well-known is the one from Wade Davis, who's a pharmacological, biological anthropologist or something to that effect, from Harvard. And he spent time in Haiti and claimed to have found from a hungun, a sort of a, or actually a bokor, who's like an evil priest, or one who practices dark magic in voodoo, had gotten a powder that when applied to someone makes you die. And I say that with air quotes because you appear to stop breathing, you can't move, you fall dead. And in Haiti, where there wasn't refrigeration, you would be buried very quickly. And the idea was the bokor would dig you up a day later or 2 days later and perform another ritual on you to capture your soul, and then you would belong to the bokor and would have to work for him. And there was an argument, or there were enough stories about people finding formerly dead relatives working in plantations on the other side of the island that it's hard to say this didn't happen at all. Now, the rationalist perspective, which is generally my take on most things like this, suggests that the pharmacological part, the drug that makes you collapse, there is precedent for that, although a lot of people argue that the way Wade Davis says they make it couldn't possibly work, and it would mostly kill people. It wouldn't actually do what he says it does. But that part is technically possible. When you combine that with probable brain damage from being in a coffin for a couple days, and any other hallucinogenic drugs applied when you're brought out, and a religious system that has, as a solid part of its idea, the notion that you can be possessed, I am totally willing to buy the idea that a zombie phenomenon could be part of what's happened in Haiti. Now, what you were saying about the zombies sort of being on the border of what's right?
Like hell is on the border of what's wrong.
Okay. I think certainly within the context of the Haitian myth, the person who has been made a zombie is suffering, and that they want to go back to the grave. And there's parts of the myth are like if you feed them salt, then they wake up and they will go back and lay down in their graves. And there's a really great story in the William Seabrook essay, or the William Seabrook book, The Magic Island, about that particular tale where he talks about that. As to the sort of role they have in the voodoo pantheon, I'm afraid that's a little further than I've gone. But I know Stan West, who's a lecturer in the English department, knows a lot about voodoo, and so he might be able to answer that for anybody who wants to pursue it.
Okay, so you talk about how the zombies, like, they're not the same person that they were, but they are, but they're not. Now, how do you feel about werewolves? Do you kill a werewolf? Because for a long time, they're still who they are, but then not who they are.
Again, the right to self-defense is paramount. If the werewolf is attacking me, I don't think it's right to hunt werewolves. But I think there's also an ethical component. I mean, the Zombie Honeymoon movie that I showed here, right? Part of it that we didn't get to because you only saw a little bit is this idea that they stay together. Denise helps him, and he keeps slipping and murdering people. I mean, I think there's an ethical question. I mean, if you take my class or we talk about it later, the first thing I ask about that film is, are Danny and Denise ethical cowards? Where do they stand as people because they had this situation that they know the outcome and they did not choose to prevent it? I would like to think, and I don't know that I can say this for sure, we never really know until it happens, right? I would like to think that if I found myself in Danny's situation, perhaps after the first murder, I might rationalize, well, I'll control it. After the second out of control murder, the only ethical choice is either turn yourself into the cops or kill yourself. Because if you're murdering people and you're sane, that's wrong, just dead wrong, right? And so I think werewolves have that problem. I mean, right? Most werewolves, either they embrace their wolfiness and they go murder people at night, in which case they're wrong and they should be charged with that, right? I mean, if you think about like, True Blood, they use packs to manage themselves. On Buffy, Seth, the werewolf, locks himself in a cage at night. Or in, what's the Being Human? That's, for a while, he locks himself in a cage or goes deep into the woods and sets up his trap for himself so he won't murder people. I think there's an ethical burden on the werewolf. Yeah.
I have two questions. Do you touch on Max Brooks's books, Zombie Survival Guide and World War Z in your class?
Some. In past, I have either had people read World War Z or will read an excerpt of it. The Zombie Survival Guide, I think, is interesting, but not as fruitful for academic conversation. I mean, it's very straightforward. If you haven't read it, it is literally like how to survive the zombie apocalypse. And it's got what weapons to use, how to prepare your stronghold, how to react at different levels of outbreak. It's very practical. And he wrote it as research for World War Z, or as part of his thinking through the novel World War Z, which is amazing. But World War Z is not a horror novel, it's a science fiction novel. And by that I mean it thinks through the question of what would happen if there were a worldwide zombie outbreak like Dawn of the Dead, where the zombies spread by biting, they take over the whole world. What would happen? And from that perspective, it's interesting. But again, I don't feel like there's as many ideas in there because he's so rigid in the construction of the zombie as completely mindless, completely, there's just not as much ambiguity to it. And he doesn't, because it's an exploration of that idea, he doesn't build a lot of metaphor in for other things. Like Dawn of the Dead, the Romero masterpiece from 1978, that's the one with the picture of the elevator, them reaching in. If you haven't seen it, you should. That film is so clearly talking about capitalism, right? It's very overtly talking about it. You can't watch that movie and not realize that's kind of what they're talking about. But it becomes an allegory for something else. So a lot of times when we're talking about the Hollywood zombie movies in class, we'll talk about them in the context of sort of literary studies or film studies of the way that metaphor and allegory can be used to talk about big ideas outside of the zombie itself. So I really like those books, and but I don't find them very fruitful for academic conversation.
And then did you hear about the fungus they discovered that's like mind-controlling ants? Where it's like a zombie fungus that makes them walk up to the top of the leaf, climb down on it, so they're eaten by a bird, and then it spreads through the bird.
Yes, I am aware of that virus. It's horrifying. Yeah.
Only a matter of time.
Well, I'm one of my credentials for talking about this, or actually because of this, I'm on the advisory board of the Zombie Research Society, zombieresearch.org if you're interested. And they do a lot of stuff, but one of the things they do is they have speakers that go around, and but we have a lot of people who aren't like academics like me, but rather scientists, and there's an epidemiologist, and people who are studying the zombie question from other ways. And one of the things that I've come out of the conversation with these people is that that movie 28 Days Later, the rage virus in that movie, is really not beyond our ability right now. We could very much make a disease that would function that way, that would spread really, really virulently, that would drive you nuts in the way that rabies does. So that part is kind of terrifying for me.
And in that case, would it be ethically wrong? Because those are the only zombies as of now that I would question. Like rage zombies and stuff, I kind of feel like, man, it's messed up as it sounds. Like I feel like you still you somewhere in there. You're just really angry right now. Like
Yeah,
you need
yeah.
a timeout or something.
Well,
Like,
again,
it's not gonna stop from killing them.
Again, I think, yeah, it shouldn't stop you from killing them if they're attacking you, but hunting them down and killing them is not the best approach.
Leave me alone. What if I'm the last person on Earth and I just got to get rid of all of them? You too.
Sort of like, are you familiar with the Matheson book, I Am Legend, which they've made into a lot of different movies?
Of course I am.
Okay. So, right?
That's my.
And that one's interesting because it's sort of a zombie setup, but they're vampires, very clearly, and they have a society.
I would count them as
Right.
creatures. You don't
Right.
put them in the zombie category.
Right.
I've had this convo
They're
with somebody.
proto-zombies. Are you all familiar with, are you saying 2 minutes? You had a question?
I was saying
Oh.
that in the Matheson stuff, he's actually the monster.
Right. Right. Is anybody here familiar with Day of the Triffids? It's a fantastic novel. If you read it, you'll say like, oh, Danny Boyle just stole everything for 28 Days Later from this book. Basically, the premise of this is that there are these evil plants that are really vicious. They show up randomly, and it turns out that they have inside of them an oil that's like petroleum. So we grow them everywhere, but they have to be very carefully controlled because they have like stinging tails that they can shoot stuff and they can move, like they can lift up their roots and walk. So they're really dangerous and they can attack people very easily. But we have them all over the place because they're great for oil. So then this meteor goes by and it's like supposed to be really beautiful. So everybody goes out to look at it. Everyone who looks at the meteor or is outside when the meteor goes by goes blind. And so what happens is society collapses and the Triffids get out, right? And so the main character is one of the few people, he had been in a car accident or something, so he had bandaged eyes during the event. And so like the character in 28 Days Later, he wakes up in the hospital and there's nobody around or everybody's screaming because they're all blind. But when you read it, almost everything that happens in that novel was transmogrified into 28 Days Later. And it's a great, there's a few, if you want to read some proto-zombie novels, I Am Legend is a lot of the sort of barricade, loneliness stuff, the Day of the Triffids, and then the other one I would recommend, there's a Walter Miller novella called The Last Benediction. And that one is like Invasion of the Body Snatchers in that the virus makes you want to infect other people, but the other people don't want to be infected. And it's not clear, other than wanting to infect other people, what the virus does. So there's this interplay in which the ethics of murdering people who aren't really harming you except that they want to talk to you. And by talking to you and hugging you, they're going to infect you. But it's not clear what else happens to you because you're infected. So, that's a really great story as well. That one's called The Last Benediction.